The summer heat of 1845 pressed down on Montgomery like a hand intent on stilling every sound, and in the Whitcomb estate on Morningside Hill, the air was thick with varnish and pride. The unveiling of the family's portrait had been whispered about for weeks, a symbol of their rise from modest plantation owners to untouchable social pillars. Guests gathered in the grand parlor where the curtains were drawn to block the glare, and the towering canvas stood beneath a heavy velvet drape. When Mrs. Whitcomb pulled the cord, the fabric dropped, and a hush fell over the room. The Whitcombs were arranged as if seated in a frozen moment of afternoon leisure. Father in his high-backed chair, Mother resting one pale hand on his shoulder. Their two sons posed in crisp jackets. But it was the fifth figure, small and rigid in the lower corner, that unsettled the air. A little girl in a plain cream dress, hands folded, head turned slightly toward the viewer. Her skin was so white it seemed to glow against the dark green backdrop, and her eyes, a pale, clouded gray, did not match the living warmth of the others. No one in the room knew her, not the guests, not the visiting clergy, not the neighboring landowners who had shared harvest seasons and Sunday dinners with the Whitcombs for years. When someone quietly asked Mrs. Whitcomb who the child was, she answered with a serene certainty that chilled more than it reassured. The girl had always been there. She was family. The explanation was offered as if the question itself were improper, as though forgetting this child's existence was a social offense. Guests murmured their apologies, but their eyes lingered on the girl's stiff posture, the way her feet seemed not quite to touch the painted floor. Servants began to whisper after the gathering broke apart. They said her hands were wrong, too smooth with no lines at the knuckles. They said her head was turned just enough that the right side of her face seemed blurred, as if the paint there resisted the brush. Some swore the painter had worked alone in a locked room for weeks, turning away food unless it was delivered by the youngest scullery maids. Those girls, pale and withdrawn after the delivery, refused to say what they had seen inside. One was overheard weeping in the laundry room, repeating over and over that the child's eyes had been open the whole time, but she never blinked. The Whitcombs had always commanded respect, but after the unveiling, a quiet unease began to shadow them. The family no longer walked to church together, and the children were kept inside except for tightly controlled appearances. The artist left town within a fortnight, claiming another commission in Savannah, but he avoided the main roads, traveling by night as if to escape notice. He left behind no sketches, no preliminary studies, and not a single record of payment for his work. In the weeks that followed, 2 local children vanished, a boy on his way back from the mill and a girl last seen collecting laundry from a line. Their disappearances were noted, but no one dared tie them to the Whitcombs, not allowed. Still, some servants recalled the faint smell of oil and something metallic drifting from the portrait room long after the canvas had been hung. Inside that room, the floorboards were always warm to the touch. Mrs. Whitcomb kept the curtains drawn, claiming the sunlight would fade the paint. But those who had reason to enter spoke of a strange heaviness there, as if the air itself resisted movement. The gaze of the painted child followed them from door to hearth, and though it was only pigment and canvas, there was a pressure in those pale eyes, a pressure that suggested she had been made to sit longer than any child could bear, that the act of holding her stillness had taken something vital from her. The truth, known only to the family, was that the girl's inclusion was no accident. She was not imagined, nor was she a gesture of artistic liberty. She had sat in that room for weeks under the strict control of a mind that viewed suffering as both art and necessity. She had been kept upright with straps under her dress, her arms bound so gently and invisibly that she could not move without the bindings pulling her skin raw. The painter's hands had been guided by another's instructions. to capture the exact moment when her will began to break, when she no longer fought to be released but accepted her stillness as permanent. Food had been withheld for days at a time to keep her face gaunt and her body light enough for the posing frame. Every twitch of muscle had been trained out of her through long hours of enforced silence, her fear shaped like clay until it became the expression that now lived forever on the Whitcombs' wall. When the final brushstroke was laid, her usefulness was declared complete. What happened afterward was never spoken of, not even among the family. But the servants knew the smell of freshly turned earth, and they saw the gardener hauling soil from behind the east wing late one night, his hands trembling as he worked. The next morning, the portrait was hung, and the Whitcombs stood in front of it as though nothing had changed. The girl in the painting would never age, never speak, never reveal the truth of what had been done to place her there. And for those who looked too long into her pale eyes, the unsettling thought began to grow. Perhaps she was still enduring her stillness somewhere, waiting for someone to notice she was missing. The portrait became the centerpiece of the Whitcomb home, admired and feared in equal measure. Every guest was shown its details, and every guest left with the memory of that strange extra child they could not place. The family's wealth swelled in the years to come, but so did the list of unaccounted-for children, each disappearance whispered about and then buried beneath the weight of polite silence. The portrait room became more than a display, and it was the quiet beating heart of something cruel, a place where absence was turned into permanence and suffering into legacy. And somewhere in the Whitcomb estate, another canvas waited, blank, for the next figure to take their place. The Whitcomb estate rose above the red clay slope of Morningside Hill like a sentinel, its white columns catching the sun by day and casting long, cold shadows by night. To the county, it was the seat of refinement, a place where summer banquets spilled onto wide verandas and music drifted from the ballroom until dawn. Guests marveled at its imported carpets, its mahogany staircases, its silverware bearing the family crest. But there were parts of the house no one was invited to see. Behind a heavy oak door at the end of the west wing, sealed with a brass key that never left Mr. Whitcomb's pocket, lay a private gallery. Its windows were boarded from the inside, the air thick and unmoving. This was no place for light, only for permanence. The gallery walls were lined with portraits, large, dark-framed, each subject rendered with unsettling precision. Their faces were familiar, though not from society gatherings or church pews. They were the faces of those whispered about in the market, names murmured over fences, the vanished whose absence had been quietly absorbed into county life, a farmhand who had gone to town for supplies and never returned, a miller's wife last seen at the river's edge, the school teacher's niece who had walked home from the church social and was found neither at home nor on the road. In the paintings, their expressions were fixed in strange half-emotions. Fear almost hidden under politeness, resignation disguised as calm, pain concealed in the set of a mouth. Every canvas had a small brass plate beneath it, not with the sitter's name, but with a single word: supplication, mirth, regret, stillness. The extra child from the Whitcombs' public family portrait had been added to this hidden collection. Here she was not placed among smiling relatives, but centered in her own frame, the background an oppressive darkness without depth. Her pale eyes were rendered with the kind of attention given to rare gems, catching the light in a way that made it hard to look away. Visitors who had been granted the rarest access, usually traveling patrons, artists, or certain officials, spoke afterward of a strange sensation when standing before her. A faint draft, though the boarded windows could not admit air, and beneath it the metallic scent of iron, faint but unmistakable, like blood long dried into wood grain. The truth behind that smell was known only to the family and their chosen artisan. Each portrait in the gallery had been painted in the very room where its subject had been restrained. The posing process was never brief. It was drawn out over days or weeks under conditions designed to produce the precise emotional state Mr. Whitcomb demanded. The artist did not merely capture likeness. He extracted essence. Hunger was applied like a painter's undercoat, softening the flesh, sharpening the bones. Fatigue followed to loosen the will. Pain was introduced not with brutality but with calculation. Joints twisted just enough to burn, muscles locked in unnatural angles so that the expression of strain could be sustained. Each pose was held until the subject's own body became their prison. When the painting neared completion, the method shifted. Mr. Whitcomb believed the eyes held the truest record of a soul, but that the soul must be brought to a specific threshold before it could be preserved. To reach it, he relied on what he called silent confession, a final stage of deprivation in which the subject was allowed neither food nor water, but was kept conscious through careful use of stimulants and cold immersion. This forced the mind into a state of fever clarity where the gaze lost all earthly anchoring. That was the moment the artist worked to capture. It was also the moment when the body, pushed past endurance, quietly failed. Death in the gallery was never sudden. It was the slow erosion of self, the victim disappearing inch by inch until there was nothing left but the image fixed on the canvas. Each completed painting was hung in its place immediately, the room growing heavier with every addition. The Whitcombs treated it as a sanctuary. They visited it privately, sometimes for hours, standing before the rows of faces as one might study trophies. Mrs. Whitcomb was said to favor the portrait labeled Serenity, a young mother who had vanished during a rainstorm. She would stand close enough to touch the frame, her lips moving silently. Mr. Whitcomb, however, preferred Defiance, the miller's wife, whose jaw remained tight even as her eyes betrayed surrender. He claimed he could still smell the oils used on her canvas, though years had passed. To outsiders, the locked rooms of the West Wing were simply an eccentricity of the wealthy, an indulgence for rare art or private study. But the servants knew. They knew the muffled sounds that slipped under the door at night, the long, low moans, the sudden sharp breaths, the scraping of chair legs across wood. They knew the way buckets were carried out in the early hours, their contents covered, the water inside tinted rust red. And they knew that the faint smell of iron that clung to the gallery was not from the nails in the walls or the hinges on the door. It was the residue of every life that had been dismantled there, drop by drop, until only the likeness remained. The gallery did not simply store paintings, it stored the methodical proof of what the Whitcombs could do without anyone daring to stop them. Each frame was a completed act of possession, each brushstroke a wound that could never heal. And somewhere deep in the house another canvas waited, its blank surface already marked in the mind of the man who decided which face would be next. Dr. Elias Harrow's presence in the Whitcomb estate was as constant as the ticking of the long case clock in the front hall. He had arrived in Alabama under the polite fiction of a visiting gentleman, but the truth was he had been quietly removed from London after whispers of what he had done in the court of King William IV began to circulate in the private corridors of the medical academies. In England, he had been celebrated as a pioneer in surgical endurance, a man who could keep a patient alive and lucid through hours of procedures that would have killed them outright under the hands of a less skilled practitioner. But his colleagues began to notice that Harrow's interest in survival was never for the patient's benefit. It was for the moments in between. The prolonged intervals where the body screamed silently, and the eyes began to reflect something he believed was truer than life itself. When Harrow settled into the Whitcomb estate, he brought with him a black leather trunk filled with devices he had commissioned in Europe. They were crafted with a jeweler's precision, but their purpose was far from delicate. Steel frames with padded clamps designed to lock a limb without breaking it. Narrow needles that could target a single nerve, delivering pulses of pain without damaging the surrounding flesh. A brass apparatus that could apply gradual, unrelenting pressure to a joint until it reached the threshold of dislocation and hold it there for hours. These were not tools for healing. They were instruments of preservation built to ensure the subject could neither die nor find escape in unconsciousness. In Harrow's philosophy, death that came too soon was a waste. He believed that the human face held a spectrum of truth that could only be unlocked in the measured descent from defiance to surrender. Pain alone was not enough. It had to be guided, layered, and timed. The mind had to be brought to the edge and kept there, suspended in the space where hope still flickered but could not ignite. This was the expression he prized, a living confession captured before the body's collapse. It was here that his alliance with the Whitcombs found its perfect shape. Their desire for portraits that went beyond likeness matched his hunger for expressions born of ordeal. The first of his sessions in the estate began with a stable boy accused of stealing. No evidence was needed. Accusation was enough. The boy was taken to a locked basement room where Harrow worked by lamplight. He began with what he called nerve isolation, a process of targeting the radial nerve in the boy's arm with fine probes until the hand seized in a permanent claw. This was not to harm the hand, but to force the muscles in the face into a specific involuntary tension. He then applied slow-turning screws to the joints of the boy's legs, increasing the pressure over hours until the trembling became constant. By the third day, the boy's expression was exactly what Harrow had sought, terror diluted by exhaustion, the eyes no longer searching for rescue but waiting for the inevitable. The portraitist was summoned and the boy was posed upright, held in place by concealed straps as Harrow's devices ensured his face would not shift. When the painting was complete, the boy was gone. No one outside the estate ever asked where. Harrow's methods became the hidden pulse of the household. Each missing person who entered the gallery's cycle passed first through his hands. A farmer's wife taken on her walk to market was kept awake for 4 days. Her nerves jolted by alternating currents from a hand crank machine Harrow had refined from military prototypes. This ensured her pupils stayed wide and her gaze locked, even as the muscles in her back failed. A traveling peddler was subjected to controlled asphyxiation, not to kill but to draw out the precise shade of desperation in his features when the air returned. The moment his chest rose in a shuddering gulp was the moment the painter worked furiously, urged on by Harrow's measured commands. The psychological toll extended beyond the victims. Even the Whitcombs, accustomed to cruelty as a tool of control, found themselves altered in Harrow's presence. He spoke of his work with the calm of a physician explaining a cure, and in that composure was something more dangerous than rage. He made atrocity sound reasonable, necessary even, framing each session as the extraction of something rare and valuable. His quiet certainty infected the household. Mrs. Whitcomb began suggesting which expressions would suit the next empty frame. Mr. Whitcomb stood in on sessions, learning how different pressures could coax subtle changes in the eyes. The servants, forced to carry water and cloths to the locked rooms, began to move through the house as if under a spell, avoiding one another's gaze, their silence an unspoken pact to survive. What made Harrow's evil so enduring was its lack of spectacle. There was no frenzy, no blood-soaked display. His was an art of precision, of removing hope in measured increments until the subject was a vessel for the emotion he wanted to preserve. The deaths that followed were not accidents of cruelty, but the final brushstroke on a canvas of suffering as deliberate as the frame into which the finished portrait was set. And in the locked gallery of the Whitcomb estate, the result stood in ordered rows, each face a monument to the moments Harrow had stolen, each one a testament to the methodical patience of a man who believed life was only valuable at the edge of its end. Lottie had been with the Whitcombs for barely a year, a small, quick-moving girl with a habit of biting her lip when nervous. She was not the kind of servant anyone noticed for long, neither clumsy enough to draw reprimand nor bold enough to earn praise. Yet on the morning she was summoned to the West Wing for a sitting, the other maids exchanged glances. That part of the house was reserved for work no servant returned from the same. Mrs. Whitcomb herself had intercepted Lottie in the corridor, her tone as warm as sunlight as she explained that the household was preparing something special for the family's private gallery. Lottie, she said, had a face worth preserving. The words were spoken like an honor, though in this house being noticed was rarely a blessing. By midday, Lottie had not reappeared. When the cook asked after her, Mrs. Whitcomb replied without looking up from her sewing that the girl was resting in the basement, her voice carrying the faintest edge of amusement. No one dared press further. The basement in question was not the cold stone pantry where vegetables were stored, but the locked chamber beneath the gallery, a place whose entrance was always guarded by silence. There, Dr. Harrow's preparations were already underway. Lottie sat in a padded chair that seemed almost comfortable at first glance, its high back curved to cradle the spine. But leather straps crossed her chest, waist, wrists, and ankles, pulling her into a posture so rigid that every breath strained against the bindings. Her head was locked in place by a metal ring padded with felt, and her eyelids, already heavy with fear, had been forced open with delicate brass clamps that dug into the tender skin at their corners. The artist's easel stood a few feet away, a canvas half filled with shadow. Harrow moved around Lottie with the precision of a surgeon and the detachment of a collector inspecting a rare find. From his black case, he removed a slim rod connected to a clockwork mechanism, one of his nerve isolation devices. He applied its tip to the muscles beneath her cheekbone, and with each timed pulse, her mouth twitched upward in a grimace that was neither smile nor snarl. He adjusted the pressure until her face settled into an expression that hovered between shock and surrender. This, he murmured to the painter, was the moment worth capturing. The hours that followed unfolded with cruel monotony. The room was thick with the smell of linseed oil and turpentine, the air heavy and stale. Lottie's breathing grew shallow as the fumes coated her tongue and throat, a slow suffocation that dulled her thoughts but never quite pushed her into unconsciousness. Harrow monitored her closely, dabbing her lips with water just often enough to keep them from cracking. Ensuring that her skin retained the slight sheen he favored for the play of light on canvas. When her muscles trembled from fatigue, he reapplied the device to remind them of their position, sending sharp currents along the nerves until her body obeyed. By the second day, the strain had begun to hollow her eyes. She could no longer focus on the artist's movements, yet the clamps ensured her gaze remained fixed forward. Harrow seemed pleased by the change. He called it the distance, the point where the subject's mind begins to detach from the body, leaving only the shell for him to shape. The painter worked quickly now, layering strokes to trap that look before it faded. Between sessions, Harrow spoke to Lottie in low, measured tones, not to comfort, but to reinforce her isolation, reminding her that every breath she took was allowed only because he had decided it should be so. Her end came not with violence, but with the quiet finality of something used up. Late on the third night, as the artist added the final touches to the folds of her dress, her chest simply stopped rising. Harrow did not react with surprise or alarm. He only stepped forward to close the mechanism on her face, letting her features relax at last. The painter looked up, uncertain, but Harrow assured him the work was finished. Lottie's body was removed before dawn, carried out through the narrow passage that led beneath the east wing. Her absence explained away as a sudden departure to care for a sick relative. The portrait, however, remained, the first in the Whitcombs' new series to be unveiled privately to their closest associates. It hung in the inner gallery, her face forever caught in that perfect, impossible expression, the eyes wide with a terror that could never fade because it had been preserved at the cost of everything else she was. Guests who saw it claimed there was something magnetic about her stare, something that made it hard to turn away even when every instinct screamed to do so. They did not know that what they were seeing was not just paint, but the end result of a process designed to strip a soul bare and hold it still long enough for someone else to claim it. And somewhere in the depths of the Whitcomb estate, Harrow was already choosing who would take her place. Beneath the Whitcomb estate, past the wine cellar and the coal bins, a narrow stairwell curved downward into a part of the house no servant claimed to know. The air grew warmer with each step, heavy with a sour tang that clung to the throat. At the bottom, behind a low iron door, was the chamber, a squat brick-walled room built decades earlier for drying sugar in the humid Alabama air. But to the Whitcombs, guided by Harrow's refinements, it had been given another purpose. Here, they would prepare their subjects for what they called final illumination, a process as calculated as it was cruel. The room was lit only by the glow of shallow iron pans arranged in a ring along the floor, each filled with a mixture of burning sulfur and steaming vinegar. The heat was oppressive but controlled, rising just enough to sear the skin without blistering it outright. The vapors hung low, wrapping the air in an acrid fog that burned the eyes and stripped the moisture from every breath. In the center stood a frame like a standing rack, its wooden supports polished smooth from repeated use. The captive was bound upright, wrists and ankles locked in iron cuffs, the spine pressed against the backboard to prevent even the smallest shift. Overhead, a crude pulley system allowed the restraints to be tightened further, forcing the body into a posture that strained every joint until the pain became constant and consuming. Harrow called it seasoning. To him, it was the same principle used in whitening raw cloth: heat, chemical vapor, and time. The process leached the natural color from the skin, giving it a pale, almost luminous quality that he insisted made the painted subject seem more eternal. But unlike fabric, the body resisted. In the first hours, the heat flushed the victim's skin a deep red, sweat rolling in thick beads down their face and chest. The sulfur gnawed at their lungs, each breath a sharp, metallic ache. The vinegar stung their eyes until they swelled half shut, but the bindings at the head kept the gaze fixed forward. By the end of the first day, dehydration set in. The tongue swelled, the lips cracked and bled, and the heart began to beat in a frantic, uneven rhythm. Harrow visited often, not to offer relief, but to observe the stages with clinical interest. He would tilt the head to study the gradual slackening of the jaw, the way the eyes dulled yet still followed movement. He would remark on the tension in the neck muscles, adjusting the bindings to preserve the sharpness of the lines for the eventual painting. The pans were replenished as needed, their fumes thickening until the captive's sweat turned to a tacky film, the skin beneath it paling in irregular patches. On the second day, the body began to betray itself. The legs trembled violently, threatening collapse, but the cuffs and pulley ensured the subject remained upright. Muscles cramped into hard knots, then twitched uncontrollably. Each convulsion sent a ripple of pain up the spine, visible in the flinch of the shoulders and the tightening around the eyes. Harrow favored this stage. He would bring the painter into the chamber, instructing him to memorize the shifting contours of the face, not just the features, but the expression of someone caught between survival and surrender. By the third day, the seasoning claimed more than color. The skin had taken on the chalky tone Harrow prized, but the body was failing. The captives' breaths came shallow and rapid, as if their chest could no longer bear the weight of the air. The sulphur's sting had burned away the voice, leaving only a faint rasp when they tried to speak. Harrow would crouch close then, studying the eyes for the exact moment when they ceased to plead and instead began to stare without expectation. He called this stillness, the final stage before the body was no longer of use. When collapse finally came, it was quiet. Knees buckled, the cuffs bit into bone, and the head sagged forward until Harrow lifted it back into place. The death itself was almost an afterthought, the slow extinguishing of a flame that had been burning too hot for too long. Harrow would order the body removed while the skin was still warm, instructing the servants to lay it out in the gallery's antechamber. The limbs were arranged according to the composition he and the painter had decided upon days earlier, and any signs of strain or injury were smoothed over with oils and powders. In the painting that followed, there would be no trace of the chamber, no hint of the fumes or the iron restraints. Only the pale, flawless skin and the expression Harrow had worked so methodically to create. Above ground, the Whitcomb estate went on as always. Tea served at the proper hour, music drifting from the parlor, guests admiring the grounds. But beneath their feet the chamber waited, its pans scrubbed clean and its straps coiled neatly, ready for the next subject. Harrow believed the work must continue without pause. After all, expressions faded and memory was no substitute for the permanence he sought. Somewhere in the county, another name was already forming in his mind, another life about to be stripped, bleached, and preserved in the silent perfection of the Whitcomb's private gallery. The Whitcomb portrait with the extra child had lingered in the minds of many who had seen it, but it was a woman from the neighboring settlement who finally gave the pale figure a name. She came forward months after the unveiling, her hands shaking as she said the child was Mary Bethany Carter, her niece, missing for half a year. The last anyone had seen of Mary was on a rain-soaked night when her voice carried down the road in shrill, desperate screams outside the Whitcomb gates. A handful of neighbors had heard her, but no one approached. The Whitcombs were not a family to be challenged, and in that silence, Mary had been swallowed whole. Inside the estate, Mary's fate had been decided before she ever stepped over the threshold. Harrow had been experimenting with what he called reverse growth, a grotesque imitation of techniques once used in sideshow exhibitions of child deformities. His belief was that a smaller frame exaggerated certain proportions of the face and hands, creating what he saw as perfect balance for a portrait. Mary's healthy build was an inconvenience. To correct it, Harrow began with calculated starvation. Not the reckless deprivation that wasted the body too quickly, but a rationing so precise it kept her alive while stripping her of muscle and softening her joints. She was fed just enough to keep her skin from graying, water given in measured sips to prevent swelling in the face. After weeks of this, the bone binding began. Leather straps and wooden splints were fitted around her limbs at night, adjusted daily to compress the growth plates in her legs and arms. The bindings forced her posture into a slight stoop, narrowing her shoulders and rounding her back so that she appeared years younger than her true age. Pain was constant, the kind that hummed low in the bones and gnawed at sleep until exhaustion was as much a part of her as breath. Harrow visited often, his hands gentle as he tightened the straps, speaking as though explaining a necessary correction to a broken instrument. He called it shaping. He called it refinement. Mary learned quickly that crying only prolonged the sessions. The method extended beyond her body. Harrow believed that the face must match the frame, and so he imposed what he termed emotive regression. Mary was forbidden to speak unless prompted, kept in dim light for long stretches so her eyes would widen instinctively in the dark. She was made to wear simple cotton dresses, always the same shade of cream, to blend her outline into the pale underlayers of the canvas. For hours she would be made to stand before a mirror with her head tilted at the exact angle Harrow desired, her reflection shrinking as the days passed, until even she seemed unsure of her own shape. By the time the painter began his work, Mary's transformation was nearly complete. Her limbs were frail, her movements slow and tentative, the bindings having taught her body that pain waited at the edge of every reach. Harrow instructed the artist to work in long sessions, capturing the slack innocence that had replaced her resistance. Mary no longer fidgeted in the chair. She simply endured, her thin hands folded, her pale eyes fixed on the point Harrow had chosen. She had become what he wanted. A figure stripped of context, a child who could have belonged to any family or to none at all. Her death was not a sudden act of cruelty, but the final step in the process. Harrow timed it for the day the portrait was completed. After the last brushstroke dried, she was led to the basement chamber and given no food or water. Her body, already diminished, could not withstand the deprivation. She drifted in and out of consciousness, the bindings still clinging to her limbs like a second skeleton. When she finally stilled, Harrow ensured her passing left no visible mark. The Whitcombs could not have their perfect child marred by signs of struggle. Her remains were hidden in a space behind the wall of the portrait room, sealed in with lime to mask the smell. The painting hung over it like a marker no one would read, her likeness now the only proof she had existed. Visitors to the estate would stand before the canvas, drawn in by the strange balance of her proportions, remarking on the delicacy of her form without knowing that it had been carved from a living child with time, hunger, and restraint. Harrow considered her a success, the method refined for future use. The Whitcombs agreed. And so Mary Bethany Carter, once a laughing, loud-voiced girl from a small settlement, became nothing more than an image in a frame, her real body bricked away in the silence of Morningside Hill. The sound of her last screams lost in the politeness of those who had heard but chosen not to act. The Whitcomb estate gleamed that afternoon as if the walls themselves understood the weight of the guest they were about to receive. Governor Benjamin Fitzpatrick arrived with a small entourage, his carriage rolling up the gravel drive under the shade of the sprawling oaks. Inside, the air was perfumed with lilac and warmed with the light of dozens of oil lamps, though the sun was still high. Mrs. Whitcomb greeted him with the softness of an old friend, her smile deepening as she led him toward the west wing, where the true treasures of the estate lay hidden from the public eye. The governor had come to see the famed private gallery, and the Whitcombs, eager to impress, had prepared their most recent work as the centerpiece. The newest portrait stood alone on an easel not yet mounted on the wall. The figure was a young man in his early 20s, dressed in fine riding clothes, his hair damp as if from a storm. The likeness was flawless, so flawless that Fitzpatrick took a step closer, his brow tightening as recognition surfaced. It was the face of Thomas Hale, the son of his political opponent, whose drowning had been reported only weeks before. Official accounts claimed he had been thrown from his skiff during a sudden squall on the river. His body recovered days later downstream. Yet here on the canvas, his expression told a different story. His eyes were wide, the whites clouded and strained, his lips parted in the rigid shape of someone gasping against an invisible force. There was a tension in the muscles of his neck, a tightness across the jaw that spoke not of the peace of drowning but of the agony of being kept alive just long enough to suffer without escape. The governor, polite in every movement, said nothing of his recognition. He offered praise for the Whitcombs' collection, his voice steady, though his hands betrayed a faint tremor. He could not have known that beneath the refined oil strokes lay the record of Harrow's newest experiment, a method he had refined over years of studying maritime accidents and battlefield wounds. The goal had been simple in Harrow's mind, to recreate the drowning expression without the damage water inflicted on the skin. Preservation was everything. Water bloated, discolored, and blurred the fine details that the Whitcombs prized in their subjects. Harrow's solution had been as inventive as it was monstrous. Thomas Hale had been taken alive, brought not to the chamber below but to a smaller room whose floor sloped toward a central drain. There Harrow constructed a platform with restraints that held the body at a downward angle, the head locked into place. A cloth was stretched over the face, and instead of water, turpentine was poured in slow, measured streams. The liquid burned on contact, searing the nostrils and flooding the mouth, its fumes suffocating faster than any river current could. Each time Hale's body bucked against the straps, Harrow would pause just long enough for the lungs to drag in a breath steeped in chemical sting, then resume. The turpentine stripped oils from the skin, leaving it pale and taut while preventing the swelling that would distort the features. The process was repeated in cycles over hours. Harrow monitored every reaction, the dilation of the pupils, the twitching in the fingers, the precise moment when the will to resist became mechanical reflex. When Hale's body finally sagged into true collapse, Harrow ensured his eyes remained open, setting them in place with minute adjustments before rigor could set in. The painter was brought in while the body was still warm, working quickly to capture the sheen of the skin and the desperate clarity in the eyes. What the governor saw on the canvas was not a memory of death, but its exact moment, preserved beyond decay. The Whitcombs had chosen to present the portrait as an unnamed work, avoiding any hint of its true identity. For them, Hale was not a person, but an achievement, proof that Harrow's methods could preserve the emotional truth of suffering without sacrificing beauty. The governor left that evening with polite words and a forced smile, but the image remained with him, vivid and unshakable. Somewhere beneath his restraint was the quiet horror of a man who suspected he had just looked into the face of a murder, framed in gold leaf and displayed like a family heirloom. In the days that followed, the portrait was hung in the gallery, its subject joining the silent assembly of faces that lined the walls. Each one had its story, each one the product of a method designed to prolong and distill suffering into something still and permanent. For Harrow, the success of the Hale experiment was only the beginning. Turpentine had given him control over both the process and the result, and he was already imagining the next subject, the next expression, the next proof that beauty could be coaxed from agony if one was patient enough to orchestrate it. And somewhere, just beyond the Whitcombs' gates, another life was already in his sights. He was no more than 12 when he stumbled out of the woods at dawn, barefoot and gasping, his skin a patchwork of raw red burns and pale blistered flesh. The boy's eyes were clouded white, the pupils milked over, staring at nothing. His mouth opened and closed as if trying to find breath between the words that spilled out in broken rushes. Those who found him swore later that they could still smell the heat on him, the faint tang of scorched skin rising from his body. He said he had been inside the Whitcomb estate, locked in a place where the sun never set, where the light itself burned and burned until it swallowed his sight. The lightbox had been Harrow's design, a perfect union of cruelty and control. It was a narrow chamber, its walls lined with angled mirrors to catch and throw every ray, its ceiling fitted with thick panels of magnifying glass that concentrated sunlight into blades of heat. Once inside, there was no shadow, nowhere for the eyes to rest. Harrow would place his subject in the center, fixed to a low stool with iron cuffs around the wrists and ankles, the head braced so it could not turn away. The light struck every inch of skin, and as the hours passed, the pain grew constant, an unbroken hum that turned breathing into a chore. The skin would swell and split in fine cracks, leaking clear fluid that dried to a tight film, pulling at the flesh with every movement. The boy spoke of days without water, of lips sticking together from heat, of eyelids forced open so the glare could etch itself into the deepest parts of the eye. He told them how the light seemed to pulse when he began to lose consciousness, how Harrow's voice would cut through the brightness, cold and steady, instructing him to lift his chin or tilt his head to let the mirrors catch the proper angle. He remembered the smell, his own skin cooking, faint at first, then overpowering. The burns were not wild or uneven, they were deliberate, spread in careful symmetry so the damage was uniform, every mark calculated for visual balance. When he could no longer sit upright, Harrow had unfastened the cuffs and left him to collapse on the floor, the light still searing down. The boy thought he would die there, blinded, his skin stretched tight over a body that no longer felt like his. But at some point, perhaps distracted or confident in the inevitability of the end, Harrow left the door unsecured. The boy crawled toward the dark, finding his way through the narrow service corridors until the smell of earth replaced the metallic tang of heat. He followed that scent until the forest swallowed him. By the time he reached the edge of town, the burns had stiffened into ridges across his arms and face, and his voice was hoarse from thirst. He told the townsfolk everything, about the lightbox, about the others who had been taken before him, about the walls of painted faces in the gallery, about the rooms where no sound escaped. He named the missing children and the farm hands, the women from the settlement, even the young man who had drowned but whose eyes on canvas told a different story. He spoke until his voice broke entirely, collapsing into the dirt at their feet. But the Whitcomb's shadow was long, and fear clung to the people like a second skin. The boy's story was called delirium brought on by fever. Some said he had wandered too close to the riverbank and been struck blind by the sun on the water. Others muttered that he was cursed, that speaking his name might draw the same fate. No one went to the estate. No one asked questions. By nightfall, the boy had been taken to a back room in the infirmary, and by the next morning he was gone. Moved, they said, to a place where he could recover in peace. That same night, the Whitcombs hosted a ball. Carriages lined the drive. The lamps along the veranda burned bright, and music spilled out over the manicured lawns. Guests laughed and drank beneath chandeliers, their voices carrying in warm waves through the open windows. The portrait room remained locked, its quiet weight undisturbed, but Harrow was seen once in the doorway of the gallery, his gaze lingering on an empty space between two gilded frames. He had already chosen how to fill it. The boy's escape had not shaken him. It had only confirmed the need for greater precision. The Whitcombs knew their power was intact. Outside, the town slept beneath its own silence, and inside the estate the work continued. She arrived on a humid afternoon, her carriage wheels cutting through the red dust of the long drive. Evelyn Whitcomb had been summoned from London with the understanding that she was to discuss the division of the family estate after a recent death in a distant branch. Her manners were careful, her speech crisp, her dress modest yet precise. Everything about her suggested she understood the etiquette of power. The Whitcombs received her warmly, their smiles practiced, their tone deferential. It was only when the formalities ended that she began to wander, drawn by the quiet hum of the house, the sense that behind its polished surfaces something waited. The West Wing was not part of the tour she had been offered, but Evelyn moved through it without hesitation. The doors here were heavier, the air cooler. She reached one at the end of a narrow corridor, its brass knob cold in her hand. Inside, the gallery stretched in a long, dim line, lit only by small lamps set low to the floor. She froze. The walls were lined with portraits, each one so vivid it seemed the subject might blink. But it was what lay beneath each frame that turned her breath shallow. Small drawers, each fitted with a brass handle and a thin label. They were not names, but single words in an even, deliberate script. Despair. Mirth. Quiet. Regret. Curiosity overcame dread, and she opened one. Inside lay a coil of hair, dark and glossy, tied with ribbon. In another, a small cloth pouch rattled softly when she lifted it, teeth still with traces of the jawbone. Every drawer she opened held something taken from the subject above it, tokens of the body paired with the frozen image on the wall. She saw faces she recognized from newspaper notices of the missing. She saw others who might have been anyone, their identities erased, reduced to an emotion decided by someone else. She had only begun to piece together the scale of what she was seeing when a shadow fell over her. Harrow stood in the doorway, his expression calm, almost welcoming, as if catching her here had been inevitable. He did not raise his voice, and did not rush her. He simply stepped aside, gesturing for her to leave the gallery, and when she did, the hall behind her closed in with the sound of the lock turning. She realized then that her arrival had never been about inheritance. Harrow had already decided her role, the final portrait in a series he called The Perfect Stillness. It was his ultimate method, designed to capture the exact instant life left the eyes. Pain alone could not do it. Too much agony clouded the gaze. Too little left it dull. This required precision. Evelyn was taken to a high-ceilinged room at the back of the estate, its walls bare but for a single canvas already stretched and waiting. In the center stood a chair fitted with leather straps at the wrists, ankles, and waist. Behind it, a frame held a steel bar with a padded clamp. She was seated, her head secured in the clamp so it could not move. Harrow's instruments lay on a table, fine saws, scalpels, a small bellows attached to a tube. He explained without hesitation, his tone almost instructional. The spine would be severed at the neck just above the shoulders with a single clean cut to ensure paralysis. This would leave her conscious for several minutes if oxygen was forced into her lungs through the primitive pumping device he had perfected. Those minutes, he believed, held the purest truth a face could offer. The silent recognition of the end, unblurred by breath or movement. When the cut came, it was almost gentle, but the shock stole her voice. She could not feel her body, but she could see Harrow step back, studying her eyes for the first shift. The moment her mind began to understand that what remained of her was now only her face. The bellows hissed as he worked it, forcing shallow breaths into her chest, prolonging the flicker of consciousness. The painter, already in place, worked with frantic precision, capturing the subtle change in the gaze, the way the pupils trembled. The final slackening when thought began to dim. Her world narrowed to the weight of the clamp, the light in her eyes, the steady rhythm of the bellows. She saw nothing else, felt nothing else. Then, without ceremony, the pumping stopped. Harrow leaned in close, watching as the last spark left her, the canvas beside them already holding its reflection. By the time the portrait was hung in the gallery, the drawer beneath it labeled Stillness. Evelyn Whitcomb had become another face in the silent assembly. Her hair was coiled in ribbon, her teeth sealed in linen. The room held its breath, as if waiting for the next subject. And somewhere in the house, Harrow was already setting aside a space on the wall, the final gap in his perfect collection. The war had taken everything from the Whitcombs. Their land stripped by new laws, their influence hollowed out by shifting allegiances, but their names spoken only in whispers as a warning about the fragility of power. By the time the last of them fled, the estate stood like a carcass on Morningside Hill, its shutters hanging loose, its gardens choked with weeds. Years passed before anyone dared step inside, but eventually the locals came, drawn by equal parts curiosity and greed. They expected silver, jewels, perhaps old coins hidden in the floorboards. What they found instead lay beneath the main house, in the cellar where the air was damp and close and the stone walls sweated with the weight of decades. There, stacked in uneven piles against the far wall, were the portraits. The gilded frames had tarnished, but the faces within remained unsettlingly intact. The colors were richer than any painting should be after so many years. The skin tones held warmth. The eyes still caught light as if wet. Even the smallest detail, a strand of hair, a faint crease beside the mouth, seemed alive. The villagers who carried them upstairs did so reluctantly, each pausing to glance at the image they held, as if expecting the subject to blink. Some swore they felt breath when they leaned too close. Others said the eyes followed them no matter where they stood. When the stack was finally catalogued, the sheer number shocked even the most skeptical. Each portrait was accompanied by a small drawer built into the base of its frame. Many still held their grisly tokens. Coils of hair brittle with age, teeth wrapped in decayed ribbon, bits of fabric stained dark. They were labeled not with names, but with words as deliberate as they were chilling. Despair, obedience, quiet, stillness. No two labels repeated. Each was a distilled moment, a single emotional truth extracted from a life that had ended to preserve it. Whispers spread quickly beyond the county, and officials came under the guise of preservation. They moved the collection to a secure location, though few knew where. Publicly, the matter was closed with a series of quiet laws. Portraiture of the dead was now regulated. Medical academies were ordered to destroy any manuals containing Harrow's procedures, and the teaching of nerve preservation techniques was banned outright. But in private, those who had handled the portrait spoke of a deeper unease, that what they had seen was not simply the product of a painter's skill or a physician's cruelty, but something that had crossed into the unnatural. Too much life remained in those eyes for them to belong only to paint. The extra child portrait, the one that had sparked the earliest whispers, was absent from the cellar. Its whereabouts were never confirmed. Some claimed it had been sold years earlier to a collector in New Orleans. Others insisted it had been bricked into one of the estate's walls before the family fled. A few believed it was still somewhere in the county, passed quietly from hand to hand, the image growing more vivid with each change of ownership. Those who claimed to have seen it after the war described a detail absent from the others. The faintest fog of breath against the glass covering, as if the child within still drew air. The Whitcomb estate eventually collapsed into ruin, the weight of neglect pulling it into the earth. The cellar was buried under fallen beams and stone, but the stories remained, told by those who had carried the paintings, those who had dared open the drawers. They spoke of the patience it must have taken to create them, the methodical stripping away of a person until only the perfect expression remained. They spoke of Harrow, whose name was scrubbed from public record but lived on in the margins of banned medical texts. And they spoke of how no one had questioned the Whitcombs while they were at their most respected, how easily the language of refinement and art had hidden the machinery of their cruelty. The years dulled the details, but not the shape of the story. It remained as a warning, though perhaps not one often heeded, that evil which hides behind civility does not need to rush, and will wait for the silence of others to complete its work. Standing now in the shadow of what had been the Whitcomb estate, with the land overgrown and the foundations swallowed by vines, it is easy to believe such things belong to the past. But the portraits, wherever they rest, remain untouched by time. And the extra child, if she is still out there, still waits in her frame, her pale eyes fixed on whoever dares meet them.